Well, welcome everyone to our latest edition of After Hours. This is a Zoom roundtable. We are from around the globe. I'm the one from Switzerland. My name is Patrick, and I'm joining in here. We have a great topic, a great panel today with the topic innovation. But it should not just see innovation, but benefits and controversies of watchmaking innovation. And I think we will have opinions, our own opinions. We are going to express our own opinions. So particularly me, I'm not necessarily expressing the official opinion of WatchBox. Before we start, I have something really personal to say. John, who is joining us here from Ohio, I know him for a long time. I actually met him for the first time when he was 15 years old. And for me, I'm proud now to sit here with him, and he knows more about watches in the meantime than I do. So let me kick this off with something very controversial. I believe that the word innovation in the watch industry has misused, has been misquoted and overstated over the last 10 years. So what do you think about this? Can you convince me otherwise?
I think I'll jump in because I think we're of the same ilk or age, or we'll let the kids convince us otherwise. But I think I agree 100%. I think the press has done a bad job promoting innovation as something wild. I mean, when Moser does a flower watch, or when someone does something just crazy, that's considered innovation, where to me, innovation is things that are actually making watches better and functionality. I mean, I wear my ceramic Batman all the time, and I mean, it's an amazingly built piece that might look the same as it did 25 years ago, but has so much innovation in the buckle, in the bezel, in different places that make it better and make it durable, and the movement lasts, and there's no service issues. And, you know, those things aren't considered as much because they're not groundbreaking visually. But from a watch user, to me, that's innovation in the highest form, is keeping something that's almost the same, just making it better.
I think that, and I guess this is my opinion, is that the watch brands as a whole over the last 10 years, as smartwatches have come into the picture, the Apple Watch, the Android Watch, they've sort of let these companies take the high-tech approach or the high-tech stance in terms of the innovation, and they've gone almost more low-tech or sort of old world. And I think that the innovation behind the scenes isn't nearly covered enough. The what goes into creating a new innovation in watchmaking is almost as innovative or more technologically advanced than the innovation itself. And, you know, if you really think about it, like an Apple Watch, it's a couple of computer chips, it's a great design. In the scheme of the world now, it's not that complicated. Like, it's not that technologically advanced for where the world is at, but the brands themselves have really given them that mantle of almost being technologically advanced or innovative, where I think that the brand should do more to promote that they're the technologically advanced ones. You know, they're the ones that are coming up with new materials or complications or way of doing things. And, you know, I'll end it with, you know, Francois-Paul Journe came out with an instantaneous perpetual calendar, which was revolutionary in terms of all the functions changing at one time. Now, to somebody that doesn't know watchmaking, may not think that this is that complicated, but when you start explaining that the technology to do this, the camera system that had to be developed to slow down the movement slow enough that they could figure out where things were even going wrong in the development, took many years to do. And I think that part of it doesn't get covered nearly enough.
Yeah, and I'd piggyback off of what Brian just said there. And certain manufacturers, I know, for example, like CHRISTOPHE CLARET, he had to invent a specific or had help building a specific CNC machine that instead of it was 12 point became a 16 point CNC machine. So in order to cut angles and produce some of the pieces he needed, he had to invest tons of time and capital into just producing the next step of whatever development he was working on. And so,
Bless you, Brian.
bless you. Yeah. Yeah, that's all right. So, you know, I think that is a undervalued and probably underpromoted part of what we consider innovation. Since I've been in the business, which is now, you know, 13, 14 years selling, and Brian and I are the same age. So you guys got a few years on us, but really since like 2000, got a couple years on us. So the innovation has been, at least from my perspective, has been sort of the material science. And Patrick, you sit in a really unique position, having, you know, directed and run a brand that was very innovative, particularly the years prior to your leadership with Rolf. And then when you were there, it was, you know, silicone-based materials and things of that nature that started becoming influential. And I look at that as sort of the major steps, major innovations in the course of my career. And then other materials like the external materials, ceramics and things like that. But you know, unless it is affecting the end user and providing some real value, I do think that a lot of times that the word innovative or innovation is being thrown around way too much.
You know, what Brian said has to do with the process, and what you're saying, John, has to do with the material. Now, processes and material help to be innovative, but people are not talking about it. If you really go back in the history, in the recent history, if you look at the Swatch watch in 1980s, that was an enormous innovation, not because of how the watch looked, but the benefit the end consumer had at an affordable price, and the way that timepiece was produced and still is produced was completely innovational. So that was revolutionary. Even if you look at the System 51, it's not the watch itself, it's actually the way they can produce it with new technologies, which makes it completely innovational.
And materials have been around for a long time. I mean, Patrick, you and I will remember, you know, back in the 80s, it was, you know, Rado first started with the high-tech ceramics and the scratch proofs and things that, you know, were super innovative material-wise, but never really revolutionized the business. I think what really revolutionizes the business is what you're talking about, the techniques that are used to make these things and how the watches are put together and built. And I know Brian was talking about this old world tradition has been brought back into this in a lot of places. I mean, you know, I'm the Longa junkie, and the best part about it is how much handwork still goes into it, even though they're using modern techniques. And, you know, production may be done modern, but it's still one man or one woman sitting at a bench, hand finishing, that makes that watch special to me. It's not that it's some crazy material that no one's ever thought of. It's the, you know, the person, you know, my idyllic, someone sitting in a, you know, place in Switzerland, or in this case, Germany, doing special handwork and techniques that might have been invented hundreds of years ago, but are now, you know, whether mass produced, but done in a production method instead of individual.
Whenever I get back to innovation within the watch industry, I tend to start looking at what's going on in other industries that I think are almost, you know, parallel in terms of how, you know, when consumers look in something similar. And I think the car industry to me is always.
Sorry.
I got him too.
I think they're gonna cut this.
There you go.
Callahan's still working at home.
So and I think the car industry is very often used as the parallel or comparative industry to the watch industry. But for me, as far as innovations in cars go, you know, it's for right now, it's really technology that's driving innovation in cars, right? You've got cars moving to electric cars or self-driving cars, or they're getting more efficient, or, you know, whatever it is. And I think that in the watch industry, you know, you almost would sooner compare it to, and we were talking about this almost before in prep, is that they're almost making like a saddle for a horse better. You know, so something that, okay, so the saddle now is more comfortable, or it fits the horse a little bit better, but, you know, it's still not necessarily changing anything for the consumer itself. And I think that innovation in the watch industry nowadays, more and more, is more design focused, like something that's changing.
And I hate that.
Something that's changing what other brands are doing or changing where the industry's going. And I think, you know, and I look at, I'm wearing a Roger Dubuis, an old Sympathy right now. And again, this at the time was very innovative in terms of not necessarily the complication, but taking old world Geneva watchmaking and combining it with a more modern stylized design. And this was like, you know, oh my God, when it came out. And I think that one of the last things that I saw that you wouldn't really call it innovative, but it did change what a lot of the brands were doing at the time, is this nouveau vintage movement, coming out with watches that were based or inspired by old watches. So there's nothing really new about that, but the design concept caught steam and then changed what almost every single brand was putting out.
But isn't that what Cartier did back in the 30s and 40s when they started doing these crazy, you know, and crashes and that kind of stuff? I mean, that's what they were, the innovation was designed back then. And I think it's gotten to the point now where they're only paying attention to things that are totally crazy and outlandish. And I fall back, you know, there's materials, but then there's also this process that's making that watch better. I mean, again, my daily watch is a Rolex, not necessarily a Cartier crash, though I appreciate the design and the innovation of it. But it's just a little too out there. And sometimes we focus on out there. I love some of the brands that have come out of nowhere. Like, to me, Resonance is an amazing one because completely different and innovative. Yeah, and just totally different. And everybody's almost ignored that market. Nobody's tried to do it as well.
Well, I think one thing which you're saying and which you're stressing, is it's the benefit of the end consumer. And the true innovation has to have a benefit to the end consumer. And I think that's one aspect. And the other aspect for me, a true innovation has to stay for some time. An innovation cannot stay for a year or two. It has to be still there after a decade or two.
Right,
if you take, for example,
exactly,
if you take in the 1700 years, Ruby, when Ruby came out, every watch has jewels. We call them now jewels. Those are artificial rubies. That invention, that's a true invention, because we don't even talk about it. But without those rubies, a watch would not be accurate, if you think about it. So if you really go back, material was always essential. And some of those really true innovations we forget because we take them for granted. Once you take an innovation for granted, then it's really an innovation, looking back.
Highlighting what Mike said, I think that, you know, Rolex is an example of innovation over time and making something incrementally better over a long period of time, you know, where it doesn't need to be 50% better the next year, but make it 5% better. Make the movements slightly more efficient, make the steel slightly stronger, make the ceramics slightly more durable, and then take that, integrate it into what you're doing, and then again, try and make the ceramic again slightly stronger and slightly better. And to me, efficiency in the movements have almost become, across the industry, you know, how they're touting innovation, right? Like John talked about silicium hairsprings and how they're more efficient. And you have brands coming out with, you know, the watch requires less maintenance, less lubrication, and Patrick,
longer service intervals, right?
Correct, longer service intervals. And Patrick, you really talked about what hits the consumer. What is the consumer experiencing that they're feeling this innovation? And I think that the brands really all realized one of the big things that the consumer, who's been taught year after year after year, is, okay, you need to service your watch every 2-3 years. You need to service your watch every 2-3 years. Like, okay, no, not anymore. Now it's every 5 to 10 years. And that for the consumer is a big, big difference. So they've been able to use that big difference, I think, to highlight innovation in that respect, even if it was always there to begin with.
You know what I like about what you just mentioned about Rolex? It brings me to another point. For me, a true innovation has also to do with quantities. You know, if you produce one timepiece, a one of a kind, and you say, this is innovation, doesn't mean too much for me. If something goes into, I would almost call it mass production, hundreds of pieces, thousands of pieces in the case of Rolex, then again, I think this is an important element of innovation. There has to be a certain volume.
So no, I definitely agree. And I feel like I'm taking all the air, but I wanted to ask Patrick one question and then move us on to a topic that you excel at and that Mike also, I'm sure, knows a lot about too, that's not really talked about anywhere on the forums or the trade press or anything like that, but we highlighted what goes behind a watch, the patents and process in general behind coming out with a new watch, and how there's an entire industry behind the scenes. And maybe you could just talk a little bit more about like the patents and what that's like in the watchmaking world and how that affects innovation.
I'm going to say something completely controversial. People might think I'm nuts. If we would get away of all patents in the watch industry, I think it would be the best way, because then the true entrepreneurship and creativity would come alive. Today, in the watch business, everything is protected with patents. I mean, you have timepieces with, I don't know how many patents. There's particularly one group, if they could, they would patent a glass of water, you know, if they could. Just that so nobody else could do it. So I think it's not for the benefit of the end consumer, you know, those patents. That's the first thing. So now if you take a company like, I take now Ulisnada, which is a mid-sized company, but very entrepreneurial. I have a little bit of insight there still from the past. We had one person doing nothing else but study patents and observing if somebody else would infringe patents of ours. So you have watch companies and groups, they come out with up to 200 patents a month just to protect themselves. And that works, in my opinion, against creativity.
No, it's true. I think that's an interesting point. And I think, you know, the other thing I get back to is, you know, like I think where Brian was going with this is a lot of these small specialty companies that always existed in the Swiss industry for sure. And we've started to see much, much more vertical integration in the industry. And, you know, a lot of these little companies have gone away over the years. And in fact, when I think back to the early days when, you know, no manufacturers made their own cases. So you'd see like these Vacheron, Audemars, and Patek all have that same funky case because, you know, Markowski made the case and sold it to everybody. And the hands were the same because, you know, one guy made the best hands and sold it to everybody. So there was definitely more of a, I don't know if you want to call it a cottage industry, but a, you know, cooperation between the companies that you see only really today. You know, you see a little bit of, you know, Patek and Rolex coordinate at least, if nothing else. But I feel like we've lost a little bit of that coordination between the Swiss industry, and it's not as much of a, I believe in Switzerland and I believe in Swiss watch industry as I believe in my company, and to the detriment of others, not necessarily to elevate others.
No, and
that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it actually made me think about something which is interesting. And I think that we talk about innovation, and the theme of having to produce everything yourself almost became this sign of innovation, right? You've developed your own movements. You make every component. You make everything in-house. You make your cases. You make your bracelets. But as you said, back in the past, you had somebody that was the master case maker. And even now, I'm blanking on the name, but I know that he just joined up with Acribia to make their cases. Yeah. And the gentleman I think used to make cases for Patek Philippe, if I'm not wrong.
I'm sure.
But you know, you go back in time and you say that these were some of the best cases that were ever made, or this person was responsible for designing and making some of the best cases ever made for a litany of brands. And it comes back to saying, you know, you would love to see the best of the best across the board making for the best cases that were possible, and it would force everybody to up their game if it was really just being spread around in the way that it used to be. But No, it's definitely interesting.
I mean, even the big ones, you know, and I'm talking now about the biggest names or the two biggest names, they have their sub-suppliers,
Mm-hmm.
you know, specialists, even for certain wheels, which just maybe there are two in Switzerland. If you take the case of production of silicium, there are only two companies really providing that service or having the formula to do it in Switzerland. And now a lot are benefiting of it. For example, if I take the Senate gyroscope mechanism, which is for me absolutely amazing, is only possible because they can use the material silicium. They didn't invent silicium, but they used silicium and came with their own invention. By the way, one of the most recent inventions, which I really adore. So there is a lot of cooperation behind the scenes of some specialists. It's just that the brands, they're too proud and they're not going to talk about it. You know, there's a certain ego amongst the brands and they don't even want to communicate about all those sub-suppliers, which I personally feel sad, because at the end of the day, like Mike said before, the watch industry is people-driven. So we should talk also sometimes about those sub-suppliers who produce for maybe Rolex, for Patek, for AP, and we never talk about them, which I find sad, you know.
And we're not going to start now on this broadcast.
But you know, I also agree with you that to produce everything in-house became an obsession.
Yeah.
Which doesn't necessarily mean it's a benefit of the end consumer at the end, you know.
But wasn't that push a lot? I mean, since I've been, at least on the sales side, it seems like one of the big conversations that's come out of Switzerland is what's going to happen with ETA movements. They've been talking about it for what seems like a decade now, whether or not they were going to supply outside companies, whether they were going to keep it in-house, and it sort of forced companies to develop their own movements, worried that they weren't going to have any movements to use in their own goods. You know, I think that maybe that's probably a topic for another discussion at some point, but it does sort of highlight, like, you know, when Swatch said no more ETA movements for Switzerland, they're going to have to get the movement somewhere. So, you know, Solita and some other companies sort of came out and started producing movements. But that was sort of a massive disruption to the industry. And it made it seemed like a lot of companies, they didn't panic, but they were forced to basically find solutions elsewhere. And if that meant making it in-house, then that's the direction they had to go. And so then it seemed like you saw brands that had $100 watches, all of a sudden they had $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 watches on the market. That was completely sort of out of their wheelhouse, and it changed the way people perceive these brands.
That could be a complete topic for 2 hours, probably, you know, to talk about this. But and of course now it became politicized in Switzerland. The government is involved, and that's never good, in my opinion. But what came out of it, and that's going back now almost 20 years, of course, 15 years, a lot of innovation came out of it. So it was a good thing in many ways, you know, but that was a game changer, but it brought up a lot of people. They came out of wherever they came, of the cupboards, and they became innovation. So it was a good thing as well, you know.
And it was an intentionally forced thing. I mean, that was Hayek. Not that he didn't want to be in the movement business, but he wanted to force the hands of some of the other people because he thought they had gotten lazy, for lack of a better term, and just depended on the cheap, easy alternative of a workhorse movement, and they weren't innovating. I believe that was his vision. Was he wanted the Swiss industry to get back to another level, and this was his way of forcing everyone's hand to invest.
But it turned
out to be genius.
It actually worked. You know, when you look at
it works great.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the brand,
Breitling, Panerai, IWC, all these brands that used to use ETA movements, Hublot, exactly. I mean, it worked beautifully. So it was forced innovation from a financial standpoint. I mean, it was innovate or die, and that's sometimes a good thing.
What really struck me again is watchmaking is about people. And innovation, wherever it is, and in the watchmaking for sure, has to be driven by people. And for me, a very important part is always to think about the people behind the bench, those are the creators, you know, they create the timepieces at the end. And those are also the ones who drive innovation. So I think for me, as to end the discussion is really, let's think about the people really behind the timepieces, because they make it happen.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys.
Nah,
Thank you, Patrick. It was always
hope we
great
can
joining
do
you.
that again. Sure.
awesome.
Hopefully we'll do it in person one of these days.
I hope so. Yes. Yeah. Great. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Thank you for watching.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.